Welcome everyone to our series of talks on randomness, uncertainty, and the myth of control. Well, what led me to explore this topic is events in my own life. Just recently, I've been working at a company for 4 years and they decide to sell themselves to a much larger company, and all of a sudden I had a new employer. Some people weren't quite as lucky and they were deemed to be redundant despite whatever wonderful performance they had accrued over those years. But again, just things outside of my control certainly had a very large impact on my life. And so uncertainty is there. It is just a fact of life. And we're either planning for the next moment, the next day, the next year, the next 5 years, or likely worrying about the next moment, the next day, the next year, etc. So the idea is, how can we, through our mindfulness practice, learn to cope with that anxiety and that uncertainty? And how can science help as well? So I had read a book called The Drunkard's Walk, or How Randomness Rules Our Lives, by a Caltech lecturer named Leonard Mlodinoy. And he also co-wrote A Brief History of Time with Stephen Hawking, so he knows what he's talking about. And in it he says that we actually underestimate the amount of randomness in our lives. And I think that's true. I'm sure you have incidences from your own life, but I often hear stories of how a friend of mine would go to a wedding and end up, unbeknownst to them, meeting their love of their life. I don't know if there's something in the air, but I've heard it many times. It even happened to my sister. Or you can be walking down the street and run into a friend you hadn't seen in a long time, and they say, oh, by the way, there's a wonderful opportunity at my company that I think would be perfect for you. Let me send it to you. And you end up looking at it and going for an interview and getting the job. So things like this just seem to happen all the time. And yet, because we have such lack of control over it, we do become quite anxious. And how is it that mindfulness can help us deal with this uncertainty? And how can science help as well? So one of the ways that I do it, and I'm a project manager, is I do a risk-reward assessment of situations. So I look out in the future and I anticipate certain pitfalls or certain successes, and then try and enable those things to happen. Of course, I can't really control it, but again, I can anticipate, I can assess that risk and try to minimize any damage. And we actually do that all the days, all the time anyway. Certainly using Google Maps, where we're trying to minimize the risk of getting caught in a traffic jam and being late for a meeting. Or when we do price comparing online, we're trying to make sure that we don't pay too much for something. And certainly companies do this as well. So Google will analyze huge sample sets in order to make sure they give you the best result for your search term. And Amazon will also query, millions of sales, and then compare it against your purchases in order to make sure they recommend to you things that you're most likely to buy. In fact, there's a wonderful story from the book about a mathematician who noticed that a lottery in Virginia had drastically underpriced the cost of their ticket. So the cost of the ticket was $1, but the return on your investment was going to be $4 or 400%. It's very unusual. Lotteries usually do the opposite, where they price the ticket much higher and the reward much lower, so that they can keep the balance and fulfill their obligations to the state. So, but in this case, they obviously made this mistake. This mathematician noticed it. He decided to put together a consortium of people. They each invested around $3,000, and he noticed that there were 7 million possible combinations, and so they would have to buy 7 million tickets. So they did. They went out and tried to buy 7 million tickets. In fact, they went out to these different locations, and at one location they sat there for 48 hours and bought 75,000 tickets. In the end, they were only able to buy 5 million tickets, but they still crossed their fingers and hoped that they had reduced their risk enough by the sheer number of tickets that they bought. And of course, once the winning ticket was announced, they had to go through 5 million tickets to find it, but sure enough, they had won it. So the idea is just by having this extremely large sample size, you can minimize your risk. Unfortunately, we can't really do that in our lives. We can't ask someone to marry us 1,000 times. We can't go on the same job interview hundreds of times. So we don't have that option. So what is it that we can do besides our risk-reward assessment? Well, Leonard Mlodinow says there are two laws in the natural universe that we can use or leverage or keep in mind that will help us deal with the anxiety of uncertainty. So one of them is called reversion to the mean. And what that means is that in any situation where there may be a wild swing in one direction or the other, in a certain amount of time, it will revert to its normal state or its mean. And so we've certainly seen this with the stock market after the 2008 collapse. We see it in weather patterns all the time where you can have floods or fires and then eventually they calm down and the weather returns to normal. And we can see it in our human encounters as well. Psychologists say that if you have, let's say a glorious, joyous event like a wedding, 3 to 6 months later, you're kind of just back to your normal everyday emotional state. And the same thing with tragedies, that really after a certain amount of time, you come back to your norm or your mean. So that should give you some comfort in knowing, even though that we can't control certain outcomes, we can control our behaviors and our attitudes, and know that at a certain amount of time, things will revert to their normal state. So there's comfort there. The other law he discusses is the one called the bell curve, or the plot of normal distribution. And what that is that in any possible number of outcomes, the largest possibility will be for a normal occurrence, as opposed to an extreme event like a black swan event, which I'm going to discuss in the next class. So if you're familiar with the bell curve, it kind of goes like this, and at either end we have these extremes, and they're very, very small. But the norm has the largest possibility of occurring. So if you end up getting into a situation where it's quite risky, just know that that you have the greatest chance of having at least a normal outcome and not a disastrous one. So that should give you some comfort to go ahead and be taking risks where we can't have very, very large sample sizes. So the idea is, again, with our mindfulness and we get into these anxious situations, think about these two laws of the natural universe, and also use your tools, your the stop, take a breath, observe, and proceed, because things will come back to a steady state. And then use our awareness and our meditation practice to persevere and find that sense of patience and calm, and bring courage and acceptance and kindness to the events that are beyond our control, and know that we do have control over our actions and our attitude. So thank you very much for joining. In the next class, as I said, we're going to be talking about those extreme events, those black swan events. So I hope you'll join me. And I'll have the link to Leonard Mlodinow's book attached to this talk. So thank you very much. Hope to see you again soon.